He revolutionized acting itself. Yet offstage, the man inside the legend battled demons the spotlight could never chase away. A genius who rewrote cinema's rules, but paid a devastating price for genius. Stay to discover how America's most powerful actor became a prisoner of his own myth. The 1950s belonged to Marlon Brando in ways no actor before or since has fully commanded. When he tore his shirt in A Streetcar Named Desire, audiences didn't just watch, they felt the raw, unfiltered vulnerability that no leading man had dared expose on screen. The method became gospel. Studios bent to his will. Critics crowned him the future of American cinema. But while the world saw an unstoppable force, Brando's inner world was fragmenting. The same intensity that made him revolutionary in front of the camera left him isolated, volatile, and deeply lonely when the lights faded. What few realized was that his greatest performances masked a man at war with himself, struggling with identity, masculinity, and the crushing weight of being mythologized before he'd had a chance to simply be human. The question that would follow him throughout his life remained unasked in polite company. Who was Marlon Brando when no one was watching? And why did he seem so determined to keep that person hidden? Brando's origins planted seeds that would grow into lifelong contradictions around identity and performance. Born in 1924 in Omaha, Nebraska, to a Midwestern family of modest means and artistic pretension, he inherited a restlessness from both parents that would define his entire approach to selfhood. His mother, Dorothy, was a would-be actress, talented but unfulfilled, a woman who channeled her thwarted dreams into her children with an intensity that bordered on desperation. She was theatrical, expressive, emotionally available in ways that were considered unconventional for the era. His father, Marlon Sr., was a traveling salesman, often absent, emotionally distant, a man who embodied the rigid masculinity of his generation, stoic, disapproving of artistic pursuits as soft and unmanly, contemptuous of anything that smacked of emotional vulnerability or aesthetic sensitivity. Young Marlon learned early that sensitivity was weakness in his father's world, yet he was simultaneously immersed in his mother's theatrical universe, a space where emotion was currency and performance was survival. He became a student of contradiction before he understood what contradiction meant, needing approval from a father who withheld it, absorbing his mother's hunger for the stage while internalizing his father's contempt for it. The household became a laboratory for understanding how identity shifts, depending on who's watching, how a person becomes different versions of themselves, based on the audience in the room. This fundamental tension between masculine stoicism and artistic expressiveness, between his father's demand for emotional suppression and his mother's theatrical openness, would echo through every relationship Brando formed and every character he inhabited. By the time the family relocated to Illinois during his teenage years, Brando had already developed what friends and family members would later describe as a chameleon-like quality, an ability to read a room and become whatever that room seemed to need. He was charm when charm was required, rebellion when rebellion was possible, vulnerability when it could be weaponized as performance. Drama class became his refuge, not just because it offered escape, but because it legitimized something he'd been doing his entire life, being multiple people simultaneously. By 17, he knew acting was his future. What he didn't fully understand was that the lines between performance and authenticity had already begun to blur in ways that would make it impossible for him ever to be certain which version of himself was real. The theatrical world that shaped Brando's early career, particularly New York's theater scene in the 1940s, was a space fundamentally different from mainstream Hollywood. The group theater and Lee Strasberg's method acting philosophy attracted artists, intellectuals, and people seeking refuge from the rigid social conventions of post-war America. Theater, by its nature, had always been a space where gender expression was more fluid, where androgyny was celebrated, where the exploration of emotional and psychological depths was considered not just acceptable, but essential. Brando arrived in this world as a strikingly beautiful young man, angular, magnetic, possessing a quality that transcended conventional masculine categories. He attracted intense mentorships and friendships, many with older men in the theater world, who recognized his genius and invested heavily in his development. Close friends and biographers have noted that Brando's emotional and physical relationships during this period were complex and not easily categorized by the heteronormative frameworks that would later dominate his public persona. The 1940s New York theater scene was one of the few spaces in mid-century America where such fluidity could exist, however quietly. Brando seemed to thrive in this environment precisely because it didn't demand that he choose a single, fixed identity. He could be the sensitive artist, the powerful masculine presence, the seductive performer, the vulnerable human, sometimes simultaneously. Yet the moment Brando crossed into Hollywood cinema, the rules changed fundamentally. Studios in the 1950s were paranoid about any suggestion that their male stars might be anything other than conventionally, aggressively heterosexual. The star system depended on a carefully constructed mythology of masculinity. Leading men were supposed to be conquering, confident, sexually available to female audiences, unthreatening to male audiences by virtue of their unambiguous heterosexual prowess. When Brando brought method acting to the screen in A Streetcar, named Desire, he inadvertently brought something else, a kind of masculine vulnerability and emotional openness that was radically destabilizing. His performance as Stanley Kowalski was sexually charged and brutally honest, yes, but it was also deeply introverted, psychologically complex, and weighted with an inner life that suggested depths beyond simple conquest. The way he moved, the hesitations in his speech, the surprising tenderness that flickered across his face. These elements read as revolutionary to audiences and as deeply threatening to studio executives. The industry's response was swift. Brando must be locked down, controlled, presented to the world in ways that made his sexuality unambiguous and his masculinity undeniable. Publicists worked overtime to engineer his image as a heterosexual desirable, a man's man, someone whose sexual power was directed exclusively toward women. This manufactured image, however, sat in constant tension with Brando's actual life and relationships. He maintained intense, emotionally intimate friendships with men throughout his life, relationships that transcended the conventional boundaries of male friendship in mid-century America. He was known to be affectionate, physically demonstrative with close male friends in ways that would have been deeply scandalous if documented and publicized. He lived much of his life in theatrical and artistic circles where his closest collaborators and confidants were men. Yet, whenever such intimacy threatened to become visible or interpretable, Brando would pivot sharply toward heterosexual relationships, marriages, public affairs, romantic entanglements that served the dual purpose of satisfying his genuine emotional needs and providing cover for aspects of his identity he had learned, through the industry's relentless pressure, could never be publicly acknowledged. What emerges from careful examination of his life is not a simple narrative of a secret gay life hidden beneath a heterosexual facade, but something more complex. A man whose sexuality and emotional identity were far too fluid, too multifaceted, to fit into the rigid categories his culture demanded. Brando's early marriage to actress Movita Castaneda in 1960 produced a son, Miko, but the union was turbulent, short-lived, and marked by the same pattern that would characterize his romantic relationships: intense connection, followed by emotional withdrawal, passion, followed by cruelty, desire, followed by rejection. The marriage lasted only a few years, but the emotional damage lingered. Then came Tarita Terapia in 1962 during the filming of Mutiny on the Bounty in Tahiti. Biographers and those close to Brando have described this relationship differently depending on who's speaking. Some saw genuine romantic love. Others saw a man desperately trying to escape himself by inhabiting another world entirely. He married her in 1962, and they had 2 children together, Petra and Tehotu. But even paradise became a prison. Tahiti, which Brando had chosen as an escape from the suffocating machinery of Hollywood, became a different kind of cage. One he'd constructed himself. He purchased an atoll, began planning a utopian community, collected people around him, and gradually isolated himself from the outside world. Friends who visited described a man increasingly paranoid about being controlled, monitored, or misunderstood. A man who seemed to be enacting fantasies of absolute autonomy, while simultaneously building structures of absolute control around those closest to him. Brando's need for control extended into all his personal relationships, with an intensity that left everyone around him bruised and confused. He demanded absolute loyalty, while offering none in return. He harbored deep insecurities about his aging body and fading relevance, and he used emotional manipulation, withdrawal, rage, seduction, humiliation, to keep those closest to him off balance and dependent. He would cultivate intense emotional bonds with people, particularly younger men he took under his wing as protégés or confidants, then sever those relationships abruptly over perceived slights or when the dynamics threatened to shift in ways he couldn't control. Colleagues and assistants described a pattern. Brando would become intensely, almost erotically focused on a young man's potential or talent, invest enormous emotional energy in mentoring and shaping that person. And then, once that person began to establish independence or question Brando's authority, would discard them with a cruelty that seemed calculated to cause maximum psychological damage. The nature of these relationships, their intensity, their emotional charge, their undertones of possession and control, suggested a man navigating desires and attachments that conventional language and social frameworks couldn't adequately describe. To frame these relationships simply as homosexual would be reductive. To ignore the profoundly erotic and emotional dimensions of them would be dishonest. What emerges instead is a portrait of a man whose capacity for connection was genuine, but whose psychological architecture made authentic, reciprocal relationships nearly impossible. The question that haunted those in his inner circle became increasingly unavoidable. Was Marlon Brando capable of genuine intimacy with anyone? Or was every relationship, heterosexual or otherwise, simply another stage for performance, another arena where he could enact fantasies of control and dominance? His children, particularly those from his later relationships, would spend decades attempting to answer this question through therapy and memoir. What they discovered was a man so fragmented between the different versions of himself he'd learned to perform that authenticity had become inaccessible to him. He could expose his emotional depths on screen with devastating precision, but he seemed constitutionally incapable of allowing anyone in his personal life to see the same truth. Instead, he cycled through patterns of seduction and abandonment, intimacy and cruelty, devotion and betrayal. The breaking point arrived not with a single incident, but with a cascade of collisions between the private man and the public myth. In 1973, Brando sent Native American activist Sachin Littlefeather to refuse his Academy Award for The Godfather, a gesture meant to protest Hollywood's treatment of indigenous peoples. It was politically noble and personally catastrophic. The establishment was outraged. The gesture read as arrogance masquerading as activism. The backlash was fierce and lasting, and it wounded Brando deeply. Not because he regretted the principle, but because it confirmed his growing paranoia that the world wanted to diminish him, to punish him for refusing to play the game according to their rules. Around the same time, his health began a visible decline. The man who had once embodied raw physical magnetism gained weight, struggled with depression, and withdrew further from public life. He began to see his body as a betrayal, a visible manifestation of his loss of control. He experimented with fasting, with medication, with various attempts at reinvention that only deepened his sense of fragmentation. Rumors circulated about affairs, financial troubles, and family crises. But the deepest crisis was internal. A man watching his power evaporate and responding not with grace, but with rage. His son Christian was arrested for manslaughter in 1990 after shooting and killing Dog Drolet, the boyfriend of Brando's daughter Cheyenne, in what the family claimed was an act of defending his sister from abuse. The trial became a tabloid feeding frenzy, and Brando, testifying on behalf of his son, gave a rambling, incoherent performance that suggested a man whose grip on reality had begun to slip. He wept on the witness stand, spoke in fragmented sentences, seemed unable to maintain coherent thought. The man who had once commanded absolute attention through precision and power now commanded it through visible deterioration. Cheyenne, traumatized by the incident and the legal proceedings, struggled with substance abuse and depression. She took her own life in 1995, and Brando never fully recovered. He had spent his life mastering the performance of emotion, but this was grief that no amount of technique could transform into art. The genius who had once changed cinema forever by insisting on emotional truth now found himself destroyed by truths he couldn't perform his way out of. What no one planned for was that Brando's final reinvention would come not through a triumphant return, but through a slow, painful retreat into almost complete seclusion. By the 1990s, he was largely absent from cinema, appearing only occasionally in small roles or direct-to-video projects, often unrecognizable beneath layers of weight and age. He gave few interviews, and when he did, they were frequently confrontational or bizarre, rants about racism in Hollywood, incomprehensible monologues, or startling moments of vulnerability that suggested a man whose internal world had become increasingly fragmented and difficult to navigate. Yet, there was a strange freedom in his withdrawal, no longer fighting for relevance, no longer performing for critics or studios, no longer constructing elaborate facades of heterosexual masculinity. Brando seemed to settle into a kind of defiant solitude. He surrounded himself with a carefully controlled inner circle, lived in his Mulholland Drive mansion like a recluse, and cultivated an almost mythological inaccessibility. The actor, who had once revolutionized performance by insisting on emotional truth, had become a living paradox, demanding absolute privacy while remaining the most scrutinized figure in American cinema. In his final years, freed from the need to perform for a public that had already made up its mind about who he was, Brando seemed to relax some of the rigid control structures he'd maintained throughout his life. Friends who saw him in this period described a man who was, for the first time, simply tired. Tired of performing, tired of controlling, tired of maintaining the elaborate machinery of his own myth. The tragedy isn't that he failed. It's that the very brilliance that made him legendary also made it impossible for him ever to be simply, quietly human, to love without controlling, to perform without fragmenting, to be seen without being consumed. If stories about the hidden costs of genius and the price of refusing to be categorized speak to you, subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of cinema's most complex figures, men and women who changed the world while being destroyed by it.